I was sitting at my desk when the envelope slid under my apartment door. At first I thought it was a flyer, another advertisement for cleaning services, or a new restaurant opening downtown. But the paper was heavier, its edges crisp, its surface glossy like it belonged to someone who cared too much about appearances. I picked it up and knew instantly who it was from. Isabel always had a taste for drama, even in stationery. The envelope was snow white with a shimmer that caught the afternoon light. A golden trim framed it neatly, and when I tore the seal open, a wave of perfume rose into the air. Not a subtle perfume either, but the kind that arrives before you do and lingers long after you leave. Isabel liked to make her presence known, even through paper. Inside was a card with swirling script in gold. Join us in celebrating the engagement of Isabel Stevens and Alexander Pierce. Their names were printed as if they were brands, Isabel's letters bold and flourishing, Alexander's slightly smaller, secondary, though he was the wealthy one. My sister had always been skilled at arranging things so that she came first. I ran my fingers over the words, feeling nothing. No warmth, no recognition, just the cold formality of being informed rather than invited. No note scribbled at the bottom, no hand that said I want you there. Just an announcement. My phone buzzed then. A text from Isabel. Hi sis, don't feel pressured to come if you're busy. Alexander's family is very high profile. Try not to wear anything too serious. Okay, love you. I read the message 3 times, slowly, each word pricking me like a thorn. Don't wear anything too serious. As if seriousness was a disease, as if it was the reason I had always been the black mark on her glittering canvas. My lips curved slightly, but it was not a smile. It was the look of someone who has heard the same joke too many times. Isabel never understood me, or maybe she never wanted to. I set the card down on the table beside me and let silence stretch across the room. Silence had been my oldest companion, the thing I returned to when voices around me were too loud, too careless, too cruel. When I was a child, silence was where I hid. Later, silence became the ground on which I built myself, the courtroom where every word mattered and no sound was wasted. Isabel thrived on noise. I thrived without it. It had been more than a year since we last spoke. That conversation ended as most did, her voice bright, confident, gliding above me, while mine was a steady wall she could not scale. She always wanted to be heard. I had learned the value of being underestimated. And yet, here she was again, tugging me back with another performance. I told myself I would not go. I told myself I had no need to watch her bask in the light of an audience that adored her. But beneath that refusal was a pulse, a stubborn beat I could not ignore. Something unfinished, something old and sharp. I lifted the card again. The date was in 2 weeks, the venue a hilltop estate outside the city, the kind of glass palace people rented not for love but for spectacle. I could see it already, the polished floors, the chandeliers, the symphony of expensive laughter. And in the middle, Isabel, radiant and adored. I thought of my parents then. My mother, likely rehearsing which necklace would catch the light best. My father, practicing the same detached expression that had carried him through decades of family dinners without ever asking how I was. Neither of them had ever seen me clearly. I doubted they would start now, but something inside me shifted that night. It was not anger, not longing. It was resolve. I had built a life far from Isabel's orbit, a life defined not by applause but by the weight of decisions that mattered. I had earned respect in rooms where she would never step. I had been called Your Honor by men who trembled in $1,000 suits. I did not need her validation. Still, the thought of facing her again drew me in like a storm cloud on the horizon. I had been her shadow long enough. Shadows learn to survive the dark, but sometimes they need to step into the light. I booked a ticket the next day, not because I wanted to be part of her celebration, not because I hoped for reconciliation. I went because I wanted to choose silence on my own terms and maybe, finally, to break it. As the days moved closer, I prepared without ceremony. I knew exactly what I would wear. Black, always black. Not the black of mourning, but the black of strength, the black that speaks without words. Isabel would see it as too serious. I saw it as armor. The night before my flight, I stood in front of the mirror and studied my reflection. My face carried lines now, not of weakness but of experience. My eyes were steady, my mouth calm. There was no trace of the girl who once clung to books in the corner while her sister performed for friends. I was not that girl anymore. The morning of departure was sharp with autumn air. I left my apartment early, suitcase in hand, the invitation tucked in a side pocket as if it were evidence in a case I had already decided. The city hummed around me, indifferent, but I felt the weight of what lay ahead. At the airport, I sat by the window as the plane taxied down the runway. My reflection hovered against the glass, a double image, Margaret now and Margaret then. The engines roared, the plane lifted, and the ground fell away beneath me. I leaned back and closed my eyes. Ahead was a performance I had seen too many times. Isabel dazzling a room, our parents nodding along, strangers laughing at the right moments. But something told me this one would not play out the same. I was not going for Isabel. I was not going for my parents. I was going for me, and I had no intention of shrinking into corners this time. The city where Isabel lived was one I had not set foot in for years. When the plane landed and the doors opened, I felt the familiar heaviness of old places pressing on me, as if the ground itself remembered who I used to be. I wheeled my suitcase through the terminal, my heels clicking against polished tile, blending in with business travelers and families reunited with hugs. No one looked at me twice. That was always my way, invisible when I chose to be, undeniable when I decided otherwise. I did not take the hotel Isabel had offered in her text. A discounted room arranged by her was never a gesture of kindness. It was a performance, a way of keeping me within her reach, under her watchful eye. Instead, I booked my own. A small boutique hotel in the older part of town, quiet and unpretentious, a place where the staff greeted me politely but without curiosity. I liked it that way. The evening air outside was cooler than the city I had left behind. Street lamps glowed in long rows, their light stretching across stone sidewalks and casting familiar shadows. I walked slowly, my suitcase trailing behind me, and allowed myself to notice things I used to miss. The rhythm of passing cars, the laughter from open windows, the scent of roasted chestnuts from a cart on the corner. The city had changed in small ways, but beneath the polish, it was still the same. In my hotel room, I unpacked carefully, setting the black dress on a hanger where it could breathe, its fabric catching the dim lamplight. I ran my hands down its length as if testing steel. It was not extravagant. It was not meant to charm. It was designed to stand. Isabel would step into sequins, glitter, silk that shimmered under chandeliers. I would step into silence, wrapped in black. I sat by the window then, staring at the skyline where towers pierced the night. Memories slipped in without permission. Isabel at 16, dazzling a group of boys with her laugh, while I sat 2 tables away, correcting notes for a debate competition. My mother, telling me to let Isabel shine. My father, silent, uninterested. Me, invisible but already building the bones of who I would become. People think invisibility is weakness. They never realize it is also training. You learn to listen when no one listens to you. You learn to watch patterns, to anticipate, to know exactly when to speak so that when you do, no one dares to interrupt. I thought of the courtroom, the place that became my home, the weight of the gavel in my hand, the silence of a room waiting for me to speak. I thought of the men who had tried to charm me, to sway me, to twist the truth, and how I had cut through their words with precision. In those rooms, I was not Isabel's sister. I was not the forgotten daughter. I was the final word. The contrast made me laugh quietly. In my world, people listened. In hers, I was still the older sister in the wrong dress, too serious for photographs. The next morning, I walked the city streets with no destination. I passed boutiques with mannequins dressed in fabrics meant to impress, and I could almost hear Isabel's voice echoing from years ago, teasing me for my plain clothes. She was always the actress, rehearsing her lines before the mirror, her smile sharp as glass. I had been the one backstage, carrying silence like a second skin. At a cafe near the river, I ordered coffee and sat outside. Couples walked hand in hand, children darted between tables, and the air was thick with the smell of bread baking. I wondered if Isabel ever sat quietly like this, if she could stand to be with herself without applause, without an audience. I doubted it. She needed the reflection of others to feel whole. I had learned to find mine in solitude. When my phone buzzed again, I knew before looking it was her. Another message, just a reminder about tomorrow night. Dress code is formal. Please don't overdo it with the black. You know how people talk. I did not answer. She still thought she could shape me, the way she had shaped everyone else. But tomorrow, she would see. Not because I wanted her to, but because truth has a way of slipping through the cracks no matter how many stories you stack on top of it. Back in my hotel, I laid out everything I needed for the evening. Dress, shoes, a small clutch, nothing flashy, nothing that asked for permission. My reflection in the mirror was steady. This was not armor for war. It was simply who I was. Night fell heavy and silent, and I found myself unable to sleep. I turned off the lamp and lay in the dark, listening to the city hum outside. My thoughts drifted back to childhood, to the countless times I had been reminded that I was not the chosen one. Isabel was porcelain and gold, I was stone and shadow. They thought shadow meant lesser. They never understood that shadow survives when glitter fades. Tomorrow would not be about revenge, it would not be about humiliation. It would be about something quieter and stronger. About finally letting them see the truth, even if just for a moment. I closed my eyes and let the silence hold me. For years, it had been the only thing that belonged to me. But tomorrow, I would walk into that glass palace, into her spotlight, and I would carry silence into the room like a verdict waiting to be read. I was not going to speak loudly. I was not going to shout. I was simply going to exist as who I was. And that, I knew, would be enough to change everything. The estate rose from the hill like glass carved into the shape of a dream. Its windows caught the late afternoon sun and scattered it in shards across the manicured lawns. Cars curved along the drive, sleek bodies reflecting the light, doors opening to release men in sharp suits and women in dresses that had never known a wrinkle. Valets moved like clockwork, their gloved hands quick and silent, guiding vehicles away as if the night itself had rehearsed for weeks. I parked further down the road, by choice. I did not want a valet to open my door, did not want anyone to take my keys with a bow. I preferred to walk, to see the scene from a distance first, to choose my own pace. Gravel crunched under my heels as I moved up the path, the sound crisp against the backdrop of laughter drifting down from the entrance. The welcome sign stood tall at the gate, gilded letters curling across a whiteboard. Isabel Stevens in bold gold, Alexander Pierce just beneath in smaller type. The imbalance told the truth before anyone inside opened their mouth. Isabel had insisted on this. She had always made herself the headline, even when standing beside someone wealthier, more powerful. She had a way of bending narratives until she was the star. At the entrance, a hostess smiled and pressed a flute of champagne into my hand. Welcome. She did not ask my name. She did not recognize me. To her, I was just another guest on the list, one more body to fill the glow of the room. Perfect. Inside, the estate pulsed with noise. Chandeliers poured light onto polished floors, and music from a quartet in the corner threaded through the air like sugar spun into glass. Guests floated in clusters, their conversations bubbling with practiced delight. I moved slowly, observing. No one turned. No one stopped to ask who I was. Isabel's orbit was bright enough to blind them all. She stood near the center, sequins catching the light, her laughter sharp and perfectly timed. People leaned toward her as if she were gravity. She glowed with the kind of ease that comes from years of applause. I found a spot near the back, close to a towering arrangement of white lilies that smelled faintly of soap. From there, I could see without being seen. My eyes searched the crowd until they landed on familiar faces. My father stood with a drink in his hand, his posture casual, his expression unreadable. It was the same look he had worn at every dinner table, present but not engaged. He nodded at comments but rarely spoke. Age had grayed his hair, but not softened him. My mother was brighter, wearing a dress that sparkled just enough to draw notice. Around her neck was a necklace I recognized, one I had sent years ago as a gift. She had never thanked me, never mentioned it. Now it rested against her collarbone as if it had always been hers. She smiled when people looked at her, wide and welcoming, but when her eyes slid over me across the room, there was only a flicker of polite confusion, as if I were a stranger she should remember but could not place. Then she turned away. I sipped the champagne. It was cold, crisp, carefully chosen. The kind of drink meant to impress but not offend. It fit the night perfectly. Isabel's gaze eventually found me. For a second, her eyes tightened, the barest fracture in her performance. Then she swept forward, her smile blossoming, her voice pitched to charm. "Margaret, you made it." She kissed the air near my cheek, her perfume thick and cloying. "I was not sure you'd come." I held my glass steady. I had time. Her eyes flicked down my dress, black and unadorned. "Black," she said, tilting her head. "Bold choice for an engagement party." I could have explained that black was the color I wore when I wanted to be taken seriously, when I wanted to remind myself that I did not need glitter to have weight. But I did not waste breath. Instead, I said, I figured someone had to ground the palate. For a heartbeat, she hesitated, unsure if it was sarcasm or truth. Then she laughed, too loudly, as if she had found the joke. "Oh, Margaret, always so intense." She turned quickly, pulling another guest into her orbit, her laughter trailing behind her like perfume. I exhaled slowly. That word again. Intense. I had carried it since childhood like an accusation, as if focus were a crime, as if silence were a flaw. To Isabel, being intense meant being unfit for the stage. But in my world, intensity was the only thing that mattered. I drifted to the side, watching her from the shadows of chandeliers. People hung on her words, nodded at her stories, smiled at her smile. She was noise, constant and bright. I was silence, waiting, steady. And silence, I had learned, always outlasts applause. I stayed in the corner longer than I should have, letting the hum of the room wash over me. The quartet in the corner shifted from one sonata to the next, their bows gliding with precision, but no one listened. The music was decoration, just like the flowers, just like the chandeliers. Everything here existed to frame Isabel, to highlight her shine. A couple near me whispered loudly enough to hear. "Who is she?" The woman asked, tilting her head in my direction. "Not sure," the man replied, adjusting his cufflinks. "Probably one of Alexander's colleagues." "No," the woman insisted, narrowing her eyes. "I swear I've seen her before. Maybe in the paper?" Their voices faded as they moved on, but their words lingered. Recognition without certainty. A seed planted. It would grow later. I moved through the room slowly, not hiding but not seeking attention either. Faces turned, smiled politely, then slid past me as if I were part of the decor. That invisibility had once stung, but tonight I let it settle like a cloak around me. At the dining table, I found myself seated near the end, far from the center where Isabel and Alexander held court. The silverware gleamed, the glasses sparkled, the plates were too delicate for real appetite. I picked at smoked duck, its skin glossy, its flavor rich but cold. Around me, conversation bubbled like champagne. I listened without trying. "Jonathan Pierce," someone said at another table, raising his glass. "The Pierces are practically royalty." And Isabel, another voice added, "She's extraordinary, such charm, such poise." I glanced at Isabel then, watching her lean in, her laugh precise, her gestures elegant. She wore admiration like a second skin, and the crowd adored her for it. A shadow fell across my plate. I looked up. Alexander Pierce stood there, tall, polished, every movement practiced. His smile was measured, his handshake rehearsed. He leaned slightly, lowering his voice as if we shared a secret. "You must be Margaret," he said. I nodded once. "That's me." He smiled wider, but it did not touch his eyes. "Isabel doesn't talk about you much. I wasn't sure if you were close." I tilted my head, meeting his gaze. "We're sisters." He chuckled, the sound polite but shallow. "She mentioned you work in government. Something with paperwork, right?" The corner of my mouth lifted, but I did not answer. He waited then. When silence stretched, he added quickly, "Important work, I'm sure." He excused himself with another smile, drifting back into the glow of Isabel's circle. I returned to my duck, unbothered. His words had not surprised me. Isabel had been rewriting me for years. The room shifted as speeches began. Friends of Isabel rose, glasses in hand, their voices high with affection. Childhood stories, exaggerated memories, laughter that coated the air like sugar. Isabel soaked it all in, her face radiant, her smile rehearsed yet convincing. Cameras flashed. Guests clapped. I stayed seated, half-shadowed by the centerpiece of orchids. Their petals were white and fragile, bending under the weight of light. I wondered how many of them would survive the night. At one point, a guest nearby leaned toward Alexander. "Does Isabel have siblings?" He shrugged, sipping his drink. "She does, but they're not close." The words fell flat against me. Not close. That was the story always. It erased birthdays missed by her, hospital visits where I was asked to wait outside, calls that went unanswered. It erased years of silence, rewritten as my choice, my flaw, but I no longer flinched. I had lived long enough to know the difference between truth and narrative. I glanced at Isabel again. She was radiant under the chandelier, sequins scattering light like sparks. Her voice carried easily, her hands graceful. Everyone looked at her, admired her, believed her. And yet, beneath all that shine, I saw the same thing I had always seen. Noise. Endless, beautiful noise. And me, at the edge of it all, holding silence like a weapon no one had noticed yet. The evening deepened, the air thick with perfume and wine. Laughter rose and fell like waves, but I stayed steady, a quiet stone in the tide. I knew what was coming. I could feel it in the way Isabel's eyes darted to me every so often, in the way her smile flickered when she realized I had not left, had not shrunk, had not bent to her narrative. This was only the beginning. The longer I stayed in that room, the more I felt the weight of its performance. Every laugh was just a fraction too loud, every story a little too polished, as if each guest had been cast in a play and Isabel had handed them their lines. And she, of course, was the lead. From my seat at the far end of the table, I watched her orchestrate the evening. A touch on the arm here, a perfectly timed laugh there. People leaned in, drank her words like they were champagne. It was the same old pattern. Isabel, glowing at the center, everyone else orbiting like satellites. But something was different tonight. I noticed the glances first. Small, fleeting like sparks catching on dry grass. Guests would turn their heads toward me, eyebrows pinched in thought, lips parted as if a name had almost formed. Then, as quickly as the thought came, they shook it off and looked away. A man across the table whispered to his wife. "Doesn't she look familiar?" The wife tilted her head, squinting. "Maybe from a magazine or television." "No," the man said, more certain now. "I've seen her face before." I just can't place it. Their words brushed against me like static. They did not know me yet, but the edges of recognition had begun to press against their certainty. Isabel noticed too. Her smile never faltered, but I caught the flicker in her eyes, the quick dart in my direction when she thought no one was looking. She sensed it. Her story was not airtight anymore. The servers cleared plates, replaced them with delicate bowls of sorbet pastel colors that melted too quickly under the chandelier heat. I pushed mine aside untouched. Hunger was the last thing I felt. Alexander circled the room like a politician, shaking hands, offering practiced compliments. Eventually, he drifted toward me again, his smile smooth. "So, Margaret," he said, pulling out the chair across from me, "I don't think we've had the chance to really talk." I sipped my water, waited. "Isabel tells me you've built a nice little career for yourself. Something with records, administrative work." I set the glass down slowly. "Is that what she told you?" He chuckled, leaning forward as if we shared a private joke. "You know, Isabel, always underselling things. But hey, honest work is honest work. Nothing wrong with keeping the wheels turning, right?" I studied him, the careful way he smoothed his tie, the way his eyes flicked to the guests nearby as if measuring how many people might overhear us. He wanted to place me neatly into a box, something small, unthreatening, easy to forget. I let silence stretch between us. His smile twitched, unsure whether to hold or fade. Finally, he excused himself, muttering something about checking on the wine. When he left, I breathed easier. It was not his dismissal that stung. I had been dismissed all my life. What mattered was the casual certainty with which he believed Isabel's story. To him, I was already written. And to her, that was the perfect outcome. But stories have cracks, and tonight I could feel them widening. As the speeches continued, I heard another pair of guests whispering. "She looks just like that woman from the papers," one said. "You remember the trial last year?" No, the other replied quickly, shaking his head. "Isabel said she works in an office." "Nothing like that." Their voices tangled with the music, but I heard them clearly. I saw Isabel hear them too. Her smile flickered again, then stretched wider, brittle at the edges. The night was building toward something. I could feel it. The air was charged, the way a courtroom feels before a verdict is read. Everyone laughs, pretends, distracts themselves, but beneath it all is tension, waiting to break. I sat straighter, hands folded neatly on my lap. Let them talk. Let them wonder. The truth was not something I needed to shout. It would arrive on its own, as it always does. And when it did, no amount of sequins or laughter would be enough to cover it. The clinking of glasses announced the next part of the evening. Isabel stood gracefully, sequins blazing under the chandeliers, fork in hand, a queen commanding her court. Conversation hushed as she tapped the rim of her glass and smiled that smile, the one I had seen my whole life, wide enough to blind, sharp enough to cut. "I just want to thank everyone for being here tonight," she began, her voice carrying easily across the hall. "Truly, Alexander and I feel so blessed." The crowd responded with soft applause. Phones lifted discreetly, recording her glow. Isabel tilted her head just right, like she had practiced in mirrors since childhood, like a dancer finding her mark. "Now," she continued, "many of you might not know this, but I wasn't always this composed." Laughter bubbled on cue. "When we were growing up, I was the wild one. My sister," she gestured vaguely toward my end of the table, was the opposite, very strict, very serious. Heads turned, eyes sliding toward me as if I were a supporting character finally named in the script. "She once filed a formal complaint," Isabel said with mock solemnity, "because I borrowed her sweater without asking. I was 13. The room erupted with laughter. Glasses clinked. People looked at me with the amusement you save for someone too stiff to join the joke. I sat perfectly still, my fork resting against the untouched sorbet, my face unreadable. Years in the courtroom had taught me the value of stillness. A judge does not fidget under scrutiny, a judge waits. "She's always been that way," Isabel went on, waving her hand dismissively. "Judgy, rigid. Honestly, I'm just grateful she came tonight. She's not big on family gatherings or, smiling." More laughter, a ripple spreading across the room. I felt each sound brush against me but did not flinch. Alexander leaned closer to the microphone someone had handed him, grinning like he was part of the joke. "Be nice," he teased. Then he turned toward me, eyes sparkling with the confidence of a man who thought he understood the scene. But really, we're lucky she made time. Isabel tells me you work in, what was it, county records? I tilted my head slightly, my lips parting but not speaking. The silence stretched just enough to grow uncomfortable. Or maybe administration. He added quickly, laughter in his voice. Either way, important paperwork, I'm sure. A few chuckles fluttered through the room, softer this time. People glanced at me uncertain. Isabel's smile tightened. I lifted my glass and wiped the rim with my napkin, slow and deliberate. My eyes met his. Where did you hear that? I asked. The words were quiet, but they cut through the room like glass. Alexander blinked, the first crack in his polished mask. Isabel mentioned something. Government work, office work, you know? I let the silence sit. Silence is heavier than words when you place it right. My gaze held his, steady, unblinking. He looked away first. Isabel laughed nervously, a sound too bright, too fast. Oh, come on, Margaret, don't be dramatic. But it was too late. The shift had already begun. I saw it in the way the woman 2 seats down narrowed her eyes. I heard it in the murmur from the table behind me. That's not right, someone whispered. I've seen her before, I swear she was in the paper. Which case? Another asked. Their voices rippled outward, a tide moving through the hall. Phones slid out of pockets, screens glowing faintly as fingers tapped quickly. Isabel kept talking, trying to drag attention back, but the air had changed. The laughter was thinner now, hesitant. The shine of her sequins no longer blinded. I sat quietly, letting it happen. I had not come here to steal her spotlight. I had not come here to prove anything. But truth, once it begins to leak, has a way of flooding the room. And tonight, Isabel's perfect story was beginning to drown. The speeches bled into each other like threads in a tapestry, each one meant to sparkle but unraveling under closer inspection. I remained at my seat, quiet, watchful, letting the tide of words wash past me. Isabel had returned to her place at the head table, her sequins catching the light like shards of broken glass. Alexander leaned in close to her, whispering something that made her laugh, though the sound was brittle. From where I sat, I could see the stiffness in her shoulders, the way she scanned the room for signs of loyalty. She was still in control, but control that thin is fragile. A friend of hers, slender, perfumed, and eager to be noticed, stood up next with a glass raised high. To Isabel, she declared, her voice lilting, the most radiant, the most charming, the most generous friend anyone could ask for. And of course to Alexander, who has the good sense to marry her. Laughter broke out again, practiced and polite. My sister accepted the toast with a graceful nod, but her eyes flicked to me, daring me to contradict the narrative. The next friend followed, telling stories of college parties, of Isabel's wild streak, of nights that ended in laughter and chaos. Every anecdote carried the same undertone. She was dazzling, unforgettable, untamable. They laughed at her recklessness, but adored her for it. Then Isabel herself rose again. She tapped her glass lightly, calling the room back to her. I can't let everyone else have all the fun, she said. I've got a few stories myself. The guests leaned forward. Phones lifted again. The stage was hers, and she knew it. I remember, she began, when I was 15 and threw a party while my parents were away. A full house, music so loud the neighbors nearly called the police. And who do you think showed up in the middle of it all, furious, holding a notebook like she was already writing a report? Her gaze slid across the room and landed on me. My sister, Margaret, she said, grinning. She threatened to shut the whole thing down unless everyone cleaned up immediately. Can you believe it? Who acts like a hall monitor at 15? The crowd laughed, some shaking their heads, others hiding smiles behind their hands. She's always been that way, Isabel continued. Serious, intense, by the book. Even when we were kids, she never let anything go. I used to think she was born 40 years old. More laughter. Isabel basked in it. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded around the stem of my glass. My face betrayed nothing. She pressed on. And tonight, I'm just grateful she's here. Because honestly, family events aren't really her thing. Smiling isn't really her thing. The laughter was thinner this time, hesitant. Some guests glanced at me, then back at her, unsure whether it was safe to laugh. I did not move. I did not break. Stillness has power. The quieter you are, the more people lean in to see if you will shatter. Alexander placed a hand on Isabel's back, chuckling as though to soften the edge. Be nice, he teased again, but the damage was already done. The words hung in the air like smoke. I let my eyes wander across the room. I saw curiosity there now, questions forming, pieces not fitting the way Isabel intended. A woman at the far table leaned toward her husband, whispering into his ear. His phone was already out, screen glowing faintly under the tablecloth. The room was shifting. Isabel did not see it yet. Or maybe she did, but believed she could laugh her way out as she always had. For me, there was no sting in her words anymore. Once, years ago, I would have burned with shame, with the desperate wish to be seen differently. But I had built a life in silence, in seriousness, in intensity. And that life had weight Isabel could never diminish. Still, I felt the old ache stir beneath my ribs, not anger, not humiliation, something more fragile. The ache of a child who once sat at dinner tables ignored, her words laughed away before they left her lips. That child had grown into a woman who commanded courtrooms. But deep inside, the memory lingered. I took another sip of champagne, letting the bubbles bite my tongue. The sweetness turned bitter quickly. Across the room, Isabel raised her glass again, smile wide, sequins blazing. "To family," she said, "even the ones who don't always know how to have fun." The toast rippled through the hall. Glasses clinked. I touched mine to my lips without drinking. Family, I thought. The word had always been hers. She carried it like a crown. For me, it was a chain I had long since broken. And tonight, those chains would break again, but not in the way she expected. The toasts ended, but the air did not soften. It thickened. Isabel had drawn her blood, and though the room still buzzed with chatter, I could sense the weight behind each glance. A few guests shifted in their seats, restless, as if they had begun to realize the performance wasn't as polished as it seemed. Dinner arrived in carefully plated courses. Lamb with rosemary, truffle risotto, roasted vegetables cut into perfect angles. The servers moved gracefully, their trays steady, their smiles distant. Around me, the guests leaned in closer to each other, speaking in tones meant to be hushed but not quite. My name was carried from one table to another, small fragments of conversation drifting like smoke. "Her, she's the sister." I thought Isabel was an only child. "No, I'm telling you, I've seen her somewhere before." The whispers wove through the air, threads tightening into a net. Isabel's head turned sharply once, then again, catching sight of the murmurs she could not control. Her smile held, but it trembled at the corners. Alexander tried to reel the attention back. He raised his glass, called for silence, and began his own speech. "First, I want to thank you all for being here to celebrate with us. Isabel is," he paused, his hand resting on hers, "everything I could ever ask for." The crowd applauded. Isabel beamed, her eyes glistening with carefully timed tears. But then, perhaps sensing her vulnerability, Alexander's smile twisted into something more playful, more cruel. "And of course," he added, glancing down the table toward me, "I want to thank Isabel's family, especially Margaret. I know paperwork must keep you very busy, so it means a lot that you could make the time." The laughter was uneven, hesitant. Some guests chuckled politely, others glanced at each other, confused. Isabel joined in, tipping her head against his shoulder, but her eyes darted to me. She wanted to see me react. She wanted proof that her version of me still held power. I lifted my glass slowly, took a calm sip, and set it down again. Nothing more. That silence unsettled them. I could see it ripple across their faces. People were accustomed to answers, to excuses, to someone defending themselves. My stillness left them with nothing to hold. The courses dragged on. Between each bite, Isabel found new ways to slide my name into her stories. Always with a laugh, always with a twist that made me the punchline. The guests played along, clapping, nodding, waiting for cues. But I noticed how their laughter never quite reached their eyes now. The woman in green at the bar caught my gaze once, her brow furrowed in thought. She whispered something to the man beside her, and he pulled out his phone under the tablecloth. I didn't need to guess what he was searching for. Isabel kept talking. "Margaret has always been the serious one, always reading, always working. I used to joke that she'd become a nun if she hadn't chosen paperwork instead." More laughter, thinner this time. My father shifted in his chair, looking at his glass instead of the stage. My mother forced a smile, her necklace glinting in the light, but her eyes were wide, darting like a cornered animal. And then it happened. A man at the far end of the room stood abruptly. His phone was still glowing in his hand. "Wait," he said, louder than he meant to. Heads turned toward him. "Judge Stevens, that's you, isn't it?" The room froze, every head swiveled toward me. Silence stretched across the hall, long and sharp, broken only by the faint scrape of a chair. I remained still, my hands folded neatly on the table. I did not confirm. I did not deny. The whispers flared instantly, faster this time, urgent. "Judge Stevens? The trial? I read about her last year." That was her. Isabel's smile cracked wide open. "Oh, come on," she said quickly, laughing too high. "Don't be ridiculous. Margaret works in administration. But she stopped, because the tide had shifted. Guests were pulling out their phones, tapping furiously, screens lighting their faces with sudden recognition. I saw it land in their eyes one by one, surprise, disbelief, respect. Isabel's sequins did not shine as brightly anymore. I reached for my glass again, steady, deliberate. The crystal stem was cool against my fingers. My silence was heavier now, weighted with truth that needed no announcement. The cracks in Isabel's story were no longer whispers. They were fractures splitting the room in two. And soon, they would break wide open. The room no longer belonged to Isabel. It trembled with questions she couldn't silence. The chandelier light that once seemed to shine only for her now revealed cracks in the image she had painted. I could feel her grip on the crowd slipping, her sequined glow dimming under the weight of curiosity. At my end of the table, guests shifted, trying to disguise their glances. Some stole quick looks at me, then back to their screens, fingers swiping, tapping. The glow of phone light reflected in their glasses, evidence gathering at a speed Isabel could not match. She tried anyway. "Judge," Isabel repeated with a laugh that cut too sharply. "Please, Margaret's always been dramatic." She probably told someone she was a judge as a joke, and now it's gone around the internet. Her laugh rang false. She knew it. They knew it. Alexander stepped in, his arm sliding around her waist as he leaned toward the microphone. "Margaret works hard, I'm sure, but let's not get carried away. Isabel has always had a flair for exaggeration. Maybe this is just another one of her stories." The crowd murmured, uncertain. Some wanted to accept his easy charm, but doubt had already rooted itself too deep. I sat perfectly still, watching them scramble, my hands folded neatly in my lap. In court, I had seen liars scramble too, fast words, forced smiles, explanations that frayed the longer they stretched. I recognized the pattern now. A woman 2 seats down turned toward me suddenly. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice breaking through the quiet hum. "Are you really?" She stopped, almost afraid to finish the sentence. Every head turned again, eyes locked on me. I met her gaze, calm. Silence stretched between us long enough to make the room restless. My lack of answer was an answer of its own. Whispers flared louder, names of trials floated through the air. Eastman case. Kingsley trial. That sentencing, I remember it. Isabel slammed her glass down a little too hard. "Enough," she said, her smile cracking at the edges. "This is my engagement party, not a courtroom." Her words were a plea, but no one was listening to her anymore. The attention had shifted, fully, undeniably. Alexander leaned closer, his voice sharp now. "Margaret, maybe you should clarify for everyone. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings." He said it like a challenge, his eyes gleaming with the confidence of someone who still believed charm could control truth. I lifted my napkin slowly, dabbed the corner of my mouth, set it gently on the plate. Then I met his gaze with steady calm. "Misunderstandings," I said softly, "only happen when no one asks the right questions." The words hung in the air, heavy, deliberate. Some guests leaned back in their chairs, others leaned forward, hungry for what would come next. Alexander's smile faltered. Isabel's hands tightened around her glass. My parents, for the first time all night, looked directly at me. The silence that followed was not empty. It was electric, alive with tension. The spark had been struck, and soon the fire would spread. The spark lingered in the air like static before a storm. I could feel it crawling across the room, making skin prickle, making people restless. No one spoke for a long moment. Glasses were half raised but forgotten. Forks hovered above plates and did not move. Isabel tried to laugh again, but the sound cracked halfway through. She lifted her glass with forced cheer. "Let's move on, shall we? We're here to celebrate love, not truth," I said quietly. The words weren't loud, but they cut through the chatter like a knife through fabric. Heads whipped toward me. Isabel froze mid-gesture, her sequins shimmering as if trying to hold the light for her. Alexander straightened in his chair. His polished smile tightened into something thinner, sharper. "I think what Isabel meant," he said carefully, "is that tonight is not about careers. It's about family, about celebration." Family, celebration. Words they used like ornaments, shiny but hollow. I let my gaze sweep the room slowly, deliberately. Their eyes followed me, waiting, impatient, like jurors sensing the verdict was near. My mother's hands trembled slightly as she adjusted her necklace. My father looked pale, his jaw tight, the first true crack in his mask of detachment. They knew what was coming, even if they didn't want to. I set my hands flat on the table, palms against linen, the gesture calm but final. "You've told your story," I said, my eyes on Isabel. "I've painted your picture. Maybe it's time the room hears mine." Gasps rippled like wind through wheat. Some guests leaned in, hungry for drama. Others shifted uncomfortably as if they'd stumbled into a play they hadn't paid for but couldn't walk out of. Isabel's face stiffened. "Margaret, you wanted me invisible," I continued, my voice steady, unhurried. You wanted me small enough to fit inside the version of me you created, a version that made you shine brighter, and you've told that story for years. But stories are fragile things, they break when someone asks a question. Whispers flared again. A woman near the bar tapped her husband's shoulder urgently, phone in her hand. I told you, that's her, the one from the Eastman case. The words spread like fire. Eastman, Kingsley, names of trials, of headlines, rolling across the room. Alexander raised his hand as if trying to quiet the wave. Let's not get carried away with rumors. Margaret, perhaps you can put this to rest. His confidence was crumbling. He didn't see it yet, but the room no longer belonged to him or to Isabel. It had already shifted. I leaned back slightly, my posture unshaken, my voice quiet but carrying. I am not an administrator. I am not a clerk. I am not a shadow in the background of someone else's story. My name is Margaret Stevens, and I am a judge. The silence that followed was thick, absolute. It pressed against every corner of the hall, squeezing the air out of laughter, smothering the last traces of Isabel's control. Someone dropped their fork. Another drew in a sharp breath. I could hear the faint tapping of screens as people searched, confirmed, read aloud. She sentenced Kingsley, one whispered. She presided over the Eastman trial, another added. My God, someone else gasped, that was national news. All at once, the truth rushed in like a flood. Faces changed. The polite smiles melted into awe, into recognition, into guilt for having laughed at me minutes earlier. Isabel's mouth opened, but no words came. Her sequins glittered, but her light was gone. She looked at Alexander, desperate for rescue, but his hand had slipped from her back. He stared at me now, his own mask shattered. I remained seated, calm, unshaken. When people don't ask questions, I said softly, they shouldn't be surprised by the answers. The verdict had been delivered. Not by shouting, not by force, just by truth, and the spark had become fire. The room was silent, but it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of impact, the kind that follows a gavel's strike, the kind that hums in the air after a truth too sharp to ignore has been spoken. Eyes locked on me. Forks and knives lay abandoned, glasses left sweating on white linen. The hum of the quartet had faltered too, bows trembling midair as even the musicians strained to listen. I could feel the weight of their stares, not as judgment but as recognition. It rolled over me, heavy and unfamiliar. For years I had carried silence like a shield. Tonight it was a weapon. Isabel tried first, she always did. Her sequins shimmered as she rose to her feet, her smile trembling but stubborn. My sister, she said loudly, forcing her voice into brightness. She's exaggerating. She always has a flair for the dramatic. She might call herself a judge, but a voice cut her off from the back of the room. She is, Judge Stevens, she ruled on the Kingsley case. All heads turned toward the woman in green, her phone still glowing in her hand. She wasn't whispering anymore, she was certain. Murmurs ignited again, stronger this time, rolling across the tables like thunder. That sentencing changed everything. I read the op-eds about her ruling. She was on the news for weeks. Isabel's laugh faltered. That can't be, another voice joined in, this one from the far left. The Eastman trial, I remember her face. She was firm but fair, everyone talked about it. The truth spread like fire, each voice adding fuel Isabel could not extinguish. Her hands tightened around her glass until I wondered if it might shatter. Alexander stood slowly, his politician's smile gone, his expression tight. This is absurd, he said, but the tremor in his voice betrayed him. If this were true, Isabel would have told me. We've shared everything. I tilted my head slightly, my eyes on him. Perhaps she preferred a smaller version of me, easier to control, easier to overshadow. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Alexander looked at Isabel then, truly looked as if seeing her for the first time. She turned toward him, panic flooding her eyes, but found no rescue there. I pushed my chair back and rose, not abruptly. Slowly, with the weight of someone who knew every movement would be remembered. My napkin slid from my lap, folded neatly, placed on the table. My hands smoothed the fabric of my dress, black catching the light but refusing to sparkle. The room leaned forward as one. I am a judge, I said again, my voice steady, unshaken. Superior Court, 11th District. The words were not boastful. They were not defensive. They were fact, delivered with the calm finality of a verdict. Silence pressed tighter around us until someone exhaled sharply, as if they had been holding their breath for too long. I looked at Isabel then. Her smile was gone, her performance cracked open. She stood there in her glittering dress, surrounded by guests who no longer looked at her with awe but with unease, as if they had just realized the star of the evening had been standing in someone else's shadow all along. And for the first time in years, I did not feel small. I felt seen. The recognition spread like a ripple, turning into a wave that swept across the hall. What had begun as whispers now roared in low, urgent conversations. Guests leaned toward one another, phones in hand, eyes flicking from their screens to me, then back again. "Look, it's her foe, Judge Stevens, right here. She was in the Herald last spring." My God, that sentencing was on national television. The evidence multiplied until denial was no longer possible. Isabel's story had collapsed, and no amount of sequins or laughter could stitch it back together. I stood still, letting the noise swirl around me, every detail of the room sharp in my vision. The chandelier above us trembled faintly as if sensing the shift in gravity. For once, Isabel was no longer the center. Alexander's hand slipped from her back completely. He stared at me with something between confusion and alarm, like a man realizing the stage had been swapped beneath his feet. "Why wouldn't she tell me?" he muttered, but loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Because the truth doesn't fit her narrative," I replied softly. The word struck harder than I intended. Several guests gasped. Isabel's face twisted, torn between fury and desperation. "Why would you do this?" she snapped, her voice sharp enough to echo. "Why would you come here, tonight of all nights, just to embarrass me?" I tilted my head. "Embarrass you, Isabel? All I did was answer a question." Her lips trembled. "You should have told me." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. "I've been telling you who I am for years. You never wanted to listen." The silence after that was deafening. My mother's hand rose to her throat, fingers brushing the necklace I had once given her. My father stared at the table, pale, as though trying to disappear into the linen. Neither spoke. They never had. Across the room, a woman in green straightened her spine and spoke again, louder this time, as if emboldened by the crack in Isabel's voice. "You should be proud, Isabel. Most people would kill to claim her as their sister." The line cut deep. I saw Isabel's expression flicker from panic to rage. She turned back to me, her sequins blazing under the light, but it was a desperate shine, the last flare of a dying flame. "You think this makes you better?" she hissed, low enough for only the nearest tables to hear. "You think standing here, throwing your title around, makes you worthy? You'll always be the same boring, lifeless girl, hiding behind your books." The words might have pierced me once. They slid off now like rain against stone. "I don't need to be better than you," I said calmly. "I only needed to stop being smaller than myself." The room drew in a collective breath. I smoothed my dress once more and stepped away from the table. The crowd parted instinctively, the same way a courtroom audience shifts when a judge rises. My heels clicked against the polished floor, each sound measured, deliberate, final. As I passed Isabel, I met her eyes one last time. She looked cornered, her glow gone, her crown crumbling. "When people don't ask questions," I told her softly, "they shouldn't be surprised by the answers." I didn't wait for her reply. There was nothing left to say. I walked through the hall, past the whispers, past the stunned silence of my parents, past Alexander's shattered composure. The doors opened before me, and cool night air rushed in, washing the perfume and noise from my skin. Outside, the estate lights glowed against the dark sky. Crickets sang faintly in the hedges. Gravel crunched under my heels as I walked to my car, steady, free. Behind me, I imagined the chaos. Isabel scrambling to rewrite the story, Alexander reeling, guests buzzing with the drama they would recount for weeks. Let them. Their noise no longer mattered. The truth had shifted the air, and the verdict, once spoken, could not be taken back. The night air was a relief. Cool, unperfumed, real. After hours under chandeliers and painted laughter, the silence of the gardens wrapped around me like something alive. I let my breath steady, each inhale sharp and clean, each exhale releasing the weight of 100 eyes. Behind me, muffled through the heavy doors, I could still hear voices rising. Isabel's laughter, shrill now, brittle, floated faintly through the cracks. She was still performing, still spinning, trying to hold the attention that no longer belonged to her. For once, I didn't care. I moved slowly across the gravel path, past the manicured hedges and glowing lanterns, heels clicking against the stone. Each sound reminded me I was still here, still myself, not the shadow Isabel had tried to force me into. My car waited at the edge of the estate, black against the pale wash of moonlight. I unlocked it but didn't get in right away. Instead, I leaned against the cool metal and let the quiet of the night seep into me. It would have been easy to drive away then, to close the chapter and never look back. But something in me resisted the clean break. Maybe it was habit, the years of holding my tongue at family dinners, of keeping still while Isabel rewrote our story. Maybe it was that old ache, the child still waiting at the edge of the table for someone to notice her. The doors opened behind me. Light spilled onto the gravel, followed by hurried footsteps. I turned my head. It was Alexander. His jacket hung loose now, his perfect smile gone. He approached quickly, hesitating only when he was a few feet away. For the first time all night, he looked unsure. "Why didn't she tell me?" he asked, his voice low, urgent. "Why keep something like this hidden?" I studied him in the dim light. His tie was crooked, his hair slightly mussed, his charm fraying at the edges. He was no longer the polished figure gliding through the crowd. He was just a man, startled by the discovery that his story was incomplete. "Because the truth makes her small," I said. "And she spent her life making sure no one saw her that way." He swallowed hard, his gaze dropping to the gravel. "I thought I knew her. You knew the version she wanted you to." The words landed heavy. He nodded slowly as if the weight of them was sinking in. For a moment I almost pitied him. He wasn't my enemy. He was just another audience member caught in Isabel's play, applauding the lines she fed him. He lifted his eyes to mine again. "And you? Why come tonight if you knew she'd do this to you?" I let the question settle. The truth was simple. "Because I'm done letting her tell my story." For a long moment, we stood there in the night, nothing but crickets and the faint hum of music between us. Then Alexander nodded once quietly and turned back toward the house. His figure slipped into the light, swallowed by the noise inside. I watched until the doors closed behind him. Then I slid into my car, the leather cool beneath me, and started the engine. The headlights carved twin beams through the dark, illuminating the road ahead. As I pulled away from the estate, I felt the last of the tension loosen from my chest. The laughter, the sequins, the brittle crowns, all of it receded in the rearview mirror. Ahead was only the night, wide and endless. And for the first time in years, it felt like mine. The road stretched ahead like a ribbon of shadow, the estate lights shrinking in my rearview mirror until they were nothing but faint stars against the horizon. I kept driving, the hum of the engine steady, the rhythm of my heartbeat slowly syncing with the dark. For the first time in years, I felt no need to rehearse my words. No internal defense, no careful script prepared for Isabel's interruptions. The silence was mine, and it was enough. But the mind, even when free, has its own way of circling back. Faces flickered in my memory, the wide eyes of the guests, the rigid posture of my father, my mother's trembling necklace. Isabel, frozen in her sequins, grasping at light that no longer belonged to her. Alexander, undone, they had all seen me tonight, perhaps for the first time. I wondered what they were saying now in the aftershock of revelation. Some would rush to Isabel, soothing her with soft words, desperate to remain in her good graces. Others would turn away, embarrassed by the laughter they had shared at my expense minutes earlier. And some, just some, might begin to question the stories they had swallowed so easily. The thought didn't bring satisfaction. It brought stillness, because I hadn't come for them. I hadn't even come for Isabel. I had come for me. The highway opened wide, and I let the car carry me further into the night. The stars above glittered sharp and cold, unbothered by the dramas of chandeliers and sequins. For years, I had lived beneath Isabel's light, bent into her shadows. Tonight, I discovered my own sky. My phone buzzed once on the passenger seat. A message flashed from an unknown number. "Judge Stevens, we need to talk. There's a case coming. You're the only one who can take it." I stared at the screen for a long moment, the hum of the engine steady beneath me. The past and the future sat side by side, both waiting. I placed the phone face down, untouched. Not now. The world could wait. Because the real twist was this. Leaving that hall, stepping out of the noise and into the night, I hadn't escaped Isabel. I hadn't destroyed her. I hadn't needed to. The truth had done that on its own. What I had done was something quieter, sharper, more final. I had reclaimed myself, and once taken back, I would never let that be stolen again. The headlights carved the path forward, endless waiting. I drove into it, my hands steady on the wheel, the night no longer heavy but alive. For the first time, I was not a shadow. I was Margaret Stevens, and the story at last was mine.